A while ago, I made a video talking about the first Capcom vs SNK game, and I reported that while the game is pretty fun, it paled in comparison to its sequel. Today, however, I'm going to finally elaborate on that topic. Ask any fighting game fan about Capcom vs SNK 2, and they'll tell you that the game is an undeniable classic. Despite being over 20 years old, CVS2 is still frequently being played in tournaments both offline and online, and players from all around the world have gotten stupidly good at the game. As I've always been a pretty casual fan of the series, I believed that I lacked the proper knowledge to create a video like this, so I asked my friend Tian, an amazing CVS2 player from the same city as me, to give me some information and reasons as to why the second game is more beloved than the first one. As a disclaimer, I understand that how much anyone likes anything is purely subjective, and I'm sure there are CVS1 fans out there who genuinely think it's a better game than CVS2, and yeah, I respect that. Don't take all of what I say in this video as pure 100% objective fact, because while I will be elaborating on things that are proven, my thoughts on the game's presentation, tone, and soundtrack, etc. are exactly that, my thoughts alone, and you're more than welcome to disagree in a respectful manner. I will also be splitting this video up into chapters for you to watch the parts that interest you the most, and there are 4 chapters in total. Alright, without further ado, let's jump into why I think Capcom vs SNK 2 is better than its older brother. Capcom vs SNK 1's main gameplay hook was the ratio system, a mechanic that, in theory, allowed you to create all sorts of teams with characters of all different power levels. You have 4 points, and you must buy your team by selecting characters who have points that add up to 4. So for example, Chun-Li is worth 2, Dan is worth 1, and Joe is worth 1. So because this team adds up to exactly 4 points, the game will let me use this team. But if I try and select Iori, Ken, and Vice, this goes over the 4-point limit, so I'm prohibited from using this team. Giving characters a certain number of points and not allowing the player to change these values is pretty interesting, but it's also restrictive. In a game with so many fan-favorite characters, limiting players to only being able to select certain characters on a team hinders creativity, and it encourages people to pick meta top-tier teams, in my opinion. In a retrospective article about the game on Polygon, former Capcom employee Seth Killian stated that people found the game boring after a while because everybody would pick larger teams of weaker characters in an attempt to stay alive for longer, and this meant that you could have upwards of 7 breaks between games. This is obviously an absurd amount of stopping and starting, so for the game's sequel, Capcom went back to the drawing board and completely revamped the ratio system. Capcom vs SNK 2 sees the return of this system, but it functions differently. It has what people sometimes call the free ratio system, because while the system in the first game was deemed as overly restrictive, the system in the sequel encourages creativity. You can have a team of 1 to 3 characters, but you can actually choose which ratio your character belongs to, affecting their relative strength. If you go with 1 character, they will have ratio 4. You can see that while they get a great damage buff, if they go down, the entire match is over, meaning ratio 4 is extremely risky because you only have 1 character. 2 characters means you've either gone with ratio 3 and 1, ratio 1 and 3, and ratio 2 and 2. While these first 2 may look like they mean the exact same thing, they can be completely different. If you have a ratio 3 character on point, that means your weakest character will be your anchor, and as such, making comebacks will be more difficult, but making the initial lead will be easier because your stronger character is going first. If you switch these numbers around, however, then your stronger character is your anchor, which is what I personally would do, because it makes making comebacks easier. Ratio 2 and 2 just means that you'd have 2 characters of, in theory, equal strength fighting together on the same team. In terms of competition, people usually go with ratio 1-1-2, because this gives you a full team of 3 characters as well as having a strong character in the back. But this is just speaking competitively, and as Capcom vs SNK 2 is also played in casual settings for fun, the almost limitless possibilities provided to players by the revamped ratio system offers a lot of unique and interesting teams for players to experiment with, which is why I believe it to be better than the first game's ratio system. Another major system that the first Capcom vs SNK game introduced is the groove system. In that game there are 2 grooves, the Capcom groove, which is based on Street Fighter Alpha 3's Aism, and the SNK groove, which is based on the King of Fighters 94. If you pick the Capcom groove, you can have up to 3 bars of meter, allowing 3 levels of supers. While characters like Ryu, for example, have specific level 3 supers like his Shin Shoryuken, you can also do level 1, 2, and 3 versions of his Shinkyu Hadoken. Also with the Capcom groove, you gain meter by attacking your opponent and by taking damage, albeit at a reduced rate this way. When you fill up a bar of meter, you get a damage buff, and this buff increases for every bar of meter that you have. So this groove encourages you to hold onto your meter to maintain the damage buff instead of spending meter the moment you get it. On the other side of things, the SNK groove requires you to hold down both heavy attack buttons to manually charge it up, and when it reaches the maximum amount, it starts draining over time, but you do gain access to a level 1 super and a damage buff. The SNK groove's damage buff is equivalent to the full buff given by the Capcom groove at full meter, so you can gain damage boosts much faster using the SNK groove. Also, when your health is critically low, you gain access to infinite level 1 supers and yet another damage buff that stacks on top of the one you gained before, and if you have full meter when in this critical state, you can perform level 3 supers. What all of this means is that there are only 2 ways to play the game, and I believe this alienates the game only to those who like one or maybe both grooves. What I think is better, however, is how CVS2 handles the groove system. Instead of simply changing some things here and there about the Capcom and SNK grooves, Capcom decided to completely change how it functions. You thought having 2 grooves was cool? Well, this game has 6 of them, and I think this is better because it provides players of all skill levels more ways to play the game. There's C groove based on Street Fighter Alpha 3's Aism, which gives you 3 bars of meter, as well as letting you cancel level 2 supers into level 1 supers. This groove also lets you perform dashes, rolls, air guards, counter attacks, and tactical recoveries. Its strengths are meter efficiency, big damage output, and small damage bonuses for filling up your meter, but the main drawback is that it requires very strong footsies and fundamentals. A groove is based on V-ism from Street Fighter Alpha 3, and this lets you perform custom combos, as well as dashes, rolls, counterattacks, and safe falls. Its strengths are that you can activate a custom combo with invincible startup whenever you have full meter. The combos you can do with this groove are amazingly meter efficient, and some characters like M. Bison and Sakura, for example, are notorious for being amazing specifically with this groove. But it also unfortunately leaves you vulnerable without meter, and some of the top tier characters can be made even stronger if they use other grooves. The P groove is based on Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, meaning it gives you parries, as well as dashes, short hops, and tactical recoveries. Its main strength is that well-timed parries give you frame advantage to let you get the upper hand on your opponent, but it also lacks other kinds of defensive options. It has a single level 3 meter, which limits how flexible you can be with meter, as well as having the weakest guard crush meter in the whole game. Moving on to the SNK grooves, the first of which is the S groove, which makes the game play like the King of Fighters 94. This lets you perform runs, dodges, short hops, counterattacks, and tactical recoveries, and its strengths are that you can convert dodged attacks into knockdowns, as well as giving characters with great level 1 supers amazing comeback potential. However, its weaknesses are that you must give up Oki to charge your meter, dodge is nowhere near as useful as roll cancels, and making even minor mistakes at low health will essentially guarantee that you lose. N groove is based on the advanced mode meter from the King of Fighters 98, and this lets you perform runs, rolls, short hops, counterattacks, counter movements, and safe falls. Its strengths are that due to the variety of movement options it provides, rushdown is very effective, and you can activate stocks whenever you want to keep your offensive momentum going. But it's also difficult to cash in all your meter with a level 3, as well as not excelling at anything in particular, so it's like an all-around kind of groove. Finally, we have the K groove, which is from Samurai Showdown and Garou Mark of the Wolves. This lets you perform runs, short hops, and safe falls, and it features the rage meter. Its strengths are that it lets you perform just defense, which give you health and reduced recovery time, allowing you to punish moves that should normally be safe. Characters do up to 35% more damage while taking around 12.5% less damage when they're in rage, and the meter itself is small enough to allow multiple rage periods per round. Its weaknesses are that the meter only builds when you take damage, so if you have low health and no meter, you're pretty much dead, as well as the meter itself not carrying over between characters, and the guard crush meter is slightly weaker than normal. Pro CVS2 players consider A and K grooves to be the best, with C coming after, then N, then P, and then S. High-level players will always use what makes the most sense in tournaments according to the game's meta, obviously they're there to win a tournament. But I still prefer CVS2's addition of these 4 new grooves, as it allows beginner to intermediate level players to experiment with the grooves they like within their team composition, leading to a more thoughtful and strategic experience. And I think Seth Killian summed it up best when he said the following: "The system mechanics went bananas, offering players a choice of 6 entirely different flavors, C, A, and P grooves, as well as S, N, and K grooves, for each of their favorite characters. Grooves didn't just swap super moves, they changed everything from defensive options on down to core movement mechanics. Combine that amount of choice with 48 characters and you've got a huge space for players to experiment and explore. Despite the first game being called Capcom vs SNK, its character roster didn't really reflect that, as it felt more like Street Fighter vs the King of Fighters featuring Morrigan. And while the game was meant to feature characters like Mega Man and Resident Evil's Leon Kennedy, they were scrapped for unknown reasons. While there is a lot of character variety in terms of appearance and gameplay, fans who wanted representation from other series were left disappointed, unfortunately. For CVS2, however, characters from games like Rival Schools, Final Fight, The Last Blade, and Samurai Showdown make an appearance, and while the roster is still mostly comprised of Street Fighter and the King of Fighters characters, it's great to see some more game diversity. More characters also lead to more pre-existing dream matchups being realized, as well as new ones coming to fruition too. Some of the really silly ones that I thought of when I was writing this video are Kyosuke vs Rock Howard, as I can picture them fighting to see who the better student is, E Honda vs Halmaru fighting to see who the biggest Japanese nationalist is, Kami vs Eagle to see who is the most British between the two, and Zangief vs Chang to see who's on the most amount of steroids. Having a large character roster with many games and characters being featured within inevitably leads to people thinking about which of their favorite characters would win in a fight with another one of their favorites. The character roster and groove systems weren't the only thing that were expanded, however. CVS1 had 4 buttons, much like any SNK fighter at the time, but for CVS2, Capcom decided to use the tried and true 6-button layout from Street Fighter, meaning that there are 3 punches and 3 kicks. Different button combinations lead to different moves depending on your groove, so pressing both light buttons in C, A, or N grooves will let you perform a roll, for example. When fans found out that CVS2 was using Street Fighter's button layout, they were ecstatic, and to prove it, let me use a quote from someone who was there when it happened. CVS1, if people don't remember, put player attacks on 4 buttons, and that didn't feel very Street Fighter-y, and I know a lot of people didn't like that, and so when CVS2 came out and it went back to 6 buttons, I mean, I wrote FAQs for both of those games, and you can kind of see it in my FAQ for CVS2. I just kept talking about the fact that it's 6 buttons again and how wonderful it is. I was so happy that it was 6 buttons, and the graphics were so good. The gameplay was really solid in it. It really felt, to me, like this is where Street Fighter needs to go. During my time writing this video, I realized that Capcom vs SNK 2 went in the opposite direction of Marvel vs Capcom 2. That series went from a 6-button layout to a 4-button layout in an attempt to streamline the gameplay, whereas the CVS2 developers went in the opposite direction. Despite this, the game's new yet familiar control scheme was easy to understand and utilize for players of all skill levels, and at the end of the day, you can't go wrong with Street Fighter's button layout. Now, let's move on to the most subjective part of the video. This section concerns the game's presentation, and I'll explain what I mean by that. When I say presentation, I'm referring to the game's UI, menus, color scheme, audio, etc. While these don't have a gameplay impact on the actual fighting, they're still an important part of the game's identity. The first thing I want to cover is the game's use of bright colors, specifically yellow. From its box art, character select screen, menu transitions, etc., yellow is an integral part of CVS2. In terms of how we respond psychologically to color, yellow is used to convey feelings of happiness and energy, which this game has in spades. The characters and even the narrator are raring to go, and they waste no time in getting into a match. I especially love the narrator, listen to him, he is crazy.
This battle is about to explode. Live and let die. This is gonna be a match to remember. Go for broke.
The whole game has this colorful, joyous energy when compared to the more mechanical, cold presentation of the first game. CVS1 makes heavy use of the colors blue and white, and its UI reminds me heavily of the older SNK games from the early 2000s. The game is subtitled Millennium Fight 2000, and as Y2K was still within the cultural zeitgeist at the time, I totally understand why Capcom and SNK wanted to heavily feature this phenomenon in the game's theme. I'll be honest, while I do think CVS2 has the better presentation, it's only by a little bit. CVS1 still looks killer, from the cool shadows in the alleyway stage to the cool menu transitions at play when you enter a fight for the first time. The game has style for days. With that being said, I do think that CVS2 is the more, let's say quote-unquote modern game. Even though CVS2's narrator makes explicit references to the 21st century just starting at the time, it still feels really cool as a time capsule back to 2001. In Japan, people who owned the Dreamcast version of the game could play online with people who owned the PS2 version, and the technology that allowed this to function was provided to Capcom by KDDI, a Japanese telecommunications company. Going back to the topic of colour for a moment, I also love how each groove has its own colour scheme to make it stand out from the rest, and it makes memorising them easy because you can just associate a colour with its properties. The angled character select screen in the first game sort of reminds me of the horrible one from BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle, where you can't see all the characters at once, and while I do appreciate that CVS1 organises characters specifically by ratio, this wasn't needed anymore due to the ratio system changes in CVS2, so now we can see all the characters displayed at once. I also really like the mode select screen. The animated flames on the orange background and the cool music that plays always stuck in my head even though I hadn't played this game in years before downloading it again for this video, and this menu does a great job of conveying information to the player while also sticking to the game's colourful theme. Diamonds are an interesting shape, and I can't say that I've seen many games heavily utilise them within their UI, but CVS2 does exactly this. I also love the screen transitions that take you from the loading screens into a match due to it looking like a news broadcast. The game developers behind CVS2 deliberately made the game feel like you're watching its battles on TV, which is a very distinctive presentation decision, and it reminds me heavily of the King of Fighters 98. In the arcade, the CVS2 machine uses a 2-channel stereo amplifier for its audio, and the newly added effects go a long way in providing depth to its sound design. Character shouts having reverb added makes it really seem like they've been knocked out, and such a small change makes a big difference. The character artwork itself is also beautifully done, and seeing characters like Morrigan portrayed in a more realistic art style is super cool and unique when compared to her dated sprite art in-game. Kinu Nishimura and Shinkiro lent their fantastic art skills to the game, and as such, every single character has gorgeous artwork that gets shown off on the character select screen. Overall, it's clear that a lot of thought and planning went into not only the gameplay of CVS2 but also its look. It's still a killer looking game all these years later, and I believe that in another 20 years the game will still look fantastic. At the end of the day, CVS2 is widely considered to be a superior game when compared to the game that came before it, and I hope that my reasonings in this video helps you learn why that is if you weren't already aware. Look, I won't pretend to be an expert at this game, but I've always loved playing CVS2 casually and exploring what all the cool and wacky characters have to offer, usually in this eye strain-inducing training stage. It's a major shame that a potential CVS3 never came to fruition, but if it did, I have no doubt in my mind that it has the potential to be even greater than CVS2, if they don't pull a Tekken 8 and force cosmetic DLC down our throats. Jokes aside, if you made it all the way to the end, thank you very much for watching and I hope you enjoyed your time here. CVS2 is easily played on PC with rollback netcode on Flycast, and if possible, I recommend playing the game via emulation online with friends to fight each other with fun and crazy teams. I'd also like to once again thank Tian, Melbourne's #1 CVS2 tech scientist, for his contributions to this video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.